Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Greg Galbicka. He received his undergraduate education at the University of Florida and then went on also to get his graduate training at the University of Florida also. He was influenced a great deal there by Mark Branch, who I think introduced him to drug research. But he went on from there to do a postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster, where he worked with John Platt and attained an interest in the process of shaping, which is often more of an art than a science, and to try to make that more precise is quite an undertaking. He went on to work at Walter Reed Institute for Research and attained the exalted position of GS-15, which those of us who never made it past GS-12 know about. And then in 2000, he moved to working at a pharmaceutical company, and many behavior analysts do work for drug companies, Dr. Galbicka has distinguished himself, continued to distinguish himself since moving there, and I think that he is going to share with us some ideas about percentile reinforcement and shaping, which have been years in the making. So, without further ado, I turn it over to him.
The topic of the tutorial today, and this is in fact going to be a tutorial. This is a very low-level introduction to response shaping and percentile schedules. Subtitle will always stop worrying about rank orders. If this gets really boring, you can search for the rest of the Stanley Kubrick solutions in the presentation today. In 1950, behavioral oriented Skinner first wrote about the differentiation of the response. That is, the explicit changing properties of the response, the intensity, the duration, the displacement, etc., through reinforcement of some responses having characteristics and other responses that didn't have those characteristics. And it was conceptually central to Skinner's decision to develop a new type of limit, to come up with one called condition. And the reason for this was the law of response magnitude. The law of response magnitude said that the intensity of the response was directly proportional to the stimulus intensity velocity. And that was clearly not the case for this new type of learning. In Skinner's words, the intensity of the response in an opera is significant only with respect to the relation, only in relation to the differential history of that organism. So from a conceptual point of view, differentiation has been very important to us as an area. But shaping, I don't think, reached its full impact until science and human behavior. In that book, Skinner outlined the notion of differentially reinforcing successive approximations to a terminal response as a mechanism for generating completely novel responses, complex response repertoires, and even maladaptive behavior. The scope and breadth of shaping within behavior analysis would be very difficult, in my opinion, to underestimate. Everything we do involves shaping. We may not always think about it, but that's what we do on a second-by-second basis. And yet, shaping has not been well analyzed, quantified, or modeled. It is a dynamic process, so it's not easily captured by the static apparatus that we started out with 50 years ago. And it is very, very subject to individual differences, which makes it difficult to provide comparable experimental exposure to different individual subjects. And as a result of that, the state of the art with respect to shaping, unfortunately, is that it remains primarily an art. We try to teach people about shaping, but in fact, shapers are very seldom shaped. They're more often selected. Those of us that are good at it are the ones that, for some reason, did it. When we do teach people about shaping, the rules that we have are fairly quantitative, called the golden rules of shaping. They're fairly quantitative. The first rule that we learned in introductory behavior analysis is to define your terminal response. You're going to shape a response, know where you're trying to get to before you do the start. The second rule is know where you're at. Always start with your subject. Start with a response that's already in the repertoire. It's the foundation for the effort to move it to the terminal response. The third rule is to use small steps. To move from where you are to where you're trying to get, establish a series of intermediate steps that you can differentially reinforce along the way to maintain the response's strength and not lose it throughout the differentiation. And the last rule is not even taught by everybody, but it's one that I think is particularly important, and that is to reinforce movement and not position. If you reinforce movement, you are reinforcing change, which promotes further change and is more likely to put you where you're trying to go. These rules are effect two fundamental processes, which basically are all shaping is about. The first fundamental process, of course, is reinforcement. And as we know, reinforcement increases the frequency of responses within an optimal class. The second fundamental process involved in shaping is extinction. And extinction, as we all know, decreases the frequency of responses that are outside of the optimal class. But that begs the question, what is this thing called an optimal class? And the operant class is probably the most important thing about shaping. Operants are not identical from instance to instance, hence the very notion of the class in the Skinner first defined operants. That class is defined by the reinforcements that are provided by the responses in that class. Extinction not only decreases responses outside of that class, but it also increases the variance of subsequent responses. And this is critically important because it generates potential new responses that may be reinforced, and as reinforced, become members of the operant class. And therein lies the rub. The reinforcement of the new operants not only increases their frequency, but it in fact redefines the class. Operants have to be thought of as things that evolve. And Skinner understood this all the way back in Science of Human Behavior. He talked about the continuous operant. The first paragraph of the chapter on shaping, he talks about shaping being like a sculpture where we do what. And he points out that you end up with something that looks unique and has a special integrity, but if you go back throughout the process, you would never be able to find a point where that uniqueness and integrity emerges. He says, in the same sense, an operant is not something which appears full grown in the behavior of the organism. It's the result of a continuous shaping process. Well, what are the contingencies implicit in shaping the way we shape? Why are the golden rules the way they are? Why do we start with the subject? Well, we start with the subject primarily to establish a history of reinforcement. It's a kind of magazine, if you will. It tells the subject, client, patient, whatever, that there are responses out there that you can make that can earn consequences. We use small steps to do two things. Small steps, first of all, establishes intermittent reinforcement, which generates persistence in the face of the extinction that we're going to have to so they're responding as the differentiation is progressive. The small steps are important also because each time we change the step, we're going to decrease reinforcement probability. And the bigger that step change, the bigger the decrease in reinforcement probability that you can expect. So you can minimize the variations in reinforcement frequency across the differentiation by finding nice step sizes to move it along gradually. Defining a terminal response. Finding the terminal response is important because along with the small steps, it gives you a direction in which you're trying to move. It helps you order responses along the differentiation dimension. And reinforced change, as I mentioned earlier, the more you reinforce deviation, the more you get deviation, and the higher the probability that you'll generate a response that can have the potential for reinforcement. So how do we go about changing these qualitative golden rules from an art to a science? Well, the preceding can all be formalized into a procedure. And it can be formalized following a very simple but a fundamental change in perspective. And that very simple change is to define upper class numbers. It's not cardinally, as we do in operant conditioning classes when we define a lower press as any press over 20 newtons, but to define them ordinally, to define behaviors in relation to other behaviors. This change in perspective, I hope to show you, provides increased prediction and control and allows us to do things that we can't otherwise do, but unfortunately it demands a fairly radical change in both the way we think about things as independent and dependent variables, and it is at odds with the history of the field as it has developed. But I hope to argue that if Skinner were alive today, starting this enterprise all over again, that perhaps he may have developed things a little bit differently. Let's go back and look at shaping these golden rules. I want to take a specific example, since I'm no longer in the laboratory, what we were talking about. A response is particularly important to me. I just got back from a couple days in Florida, and I learned that I still cannot walk. So we're going to talk about shaping a response of driving a golf ball. Now I'm going to try and shape myself to drive a golf ball farther and further and further. Hopefully this is an example that everybody can relate to. According to the golden rules, what should we do? Well, the first thing we should do is collect the baseline of drives. Well, question, how many drive lengths do I need? What's a good sample? 5, 10, 100? It's not really clear. Establish intermediate criteria. Suppose I establish that my baseline drive length is 200 yards. What should my next criteria be? 205 yards? 220 yards, 250 yards, 300 yards. What's the intermediate? What's a small step? There's a Goldilocks problem. If the step size is too small, you'll move along, but it will take you forever to learn how to drive the ball farther and farther. If the step size is too large, if I have to go from hitting a 200-yard drive to a 300-yard drive, I may never make it. I may quit going altogether. Implement differential reinforcement. If I come up with the appropriate step size, how do I determine when to move from one step size to the next step size? Do I wait until all responses are now in the new step size before moving to the next one? Or only until 20% of responses, or 50%, or 70%? What's the appropriate next? All of these questions, if you really sit back and think about it, and I did for 10 years or so, will drive me nuts. But if you forget everything you know, you'd be amazed at how much you already know. Let's switch perspectives and ask some very simple questions. What is the probability that the next drive that I hit will have a distance? Assuming I don't completely whip on the ball, what's the answer to that question? 1. Thank you. All drives have a distance. we know that already. Suppose I hit a drive and it goes somewhere. And then I hit another drive. What's the probability that that drive will be longer than my first drive? Not knowing how long my first drive was. How many want to say 50-50? It is. It's 50-50. What's the probability if I hit two drives that the next drive I hit will be longer than both of them? Now how many of you are willing to say 33.3? This is where people start to get a little freaked out by this whole situation, because you think about it as, okay, you have from 0 to your first drive, which is just the beginning, and you have from the second drive, the longest drive, out to infinity, which is another huge number. And then you have this bounded interval between the two drives. So there's no way that all three of these can have the same probability. So it can't be 0.3. But in fact, that's the answer. The next drive is equally likely to fall longer than the longest drive, as it is to be shorter than the shortest drive, as it is to be between the two drives. How can that possibly be? The problem is we're thinking of cardinal values. There are an infinite number of distributions of cardinal values that can define any sample that we do. So if I go out to the driving range and hit drives all day long, the entire woods goes up there, we will generate completely different, widely dispersed, widely disparate distributions of drives. The Tiger Woods and I share now and forever, at all points in time, the same ordinal distribution of drives. We both have one drive that's our shortest. We have one drive that's our second shortest, third shortest, fourth shortest, etc. So if you insist on paying attention to the cardinal distribution, you'll never be able to predict and control what they on my next drive. But if you'll give that up for a moment, I can tell you that we know a lot about the ordinal distribution. We know that in the distribution of m observations, there are m plus 1 potential ranks that the next drive can be. If I have one observation, the next drive can fall below it, fall above it. If I have two observations, the next drive can fall below, lowest, between the two, or above the longest. So for every m observations, there's m plus 1 potential ranks for the next drive. There is one and only one in each one of those ranks. There's one rank 1, one rank 2, one rank 3, etc. If observations are random and independent, that is, there are no sequential dependencies, that is, knowing something about a previous response doesn't help me predict the next response, then by definition, the next observation will be equally likely to assume any of the ranks in that ordinal distribution. That's simply saying the same thing. Because it's a SQAB, I'm required to put intimidating math symbols on the side. But this is very simple math. This isn't really even math. Let's assume that the next response ranks J in the m plus 1 potential ranks. We know that the probability that that rank will be somewhere between 1 and m plus 1 is 1. That just says that it's got to rank somewhere in the distribution. It has to fall along the dimension. We know that the probability of ranking any specific J is equal for all J from 1 to n plus 1. Because of that, we know that if we sum all of those individual ranks of J's up, they have to equal 1. If you rearrange that, the probability of ranking J for any specific J is therefore 1 over n plus 1. Okay? This is a very very subtle but profound move. The probability of rank J for 1 over n plus 1 is a given. It is a constant. We're talking about the probability of a response as an independent variable and not a dependent variable. That is a constant no matter who the subject is, no matter what time you're talking about, no matter what the distribution looks like, no matter what the response is, the procedure is, etc. So how can we use this to our advantage with respect to shaping? Some more fancy addition. If the probability of ranking any particular rank of J equals 1 over n plus 1, then the probability of ranking 1 is 1 over n plus 1. The probability of ranking between 1 and 2 is 2 over n plus 1. The probability of ranking between 1 and 3 is 3 over n plus 1. The probability of ranking from 1 to k is k over n plus 1. And if the probability of ranking between 1 and k is k over n plus 1, then what's the probability of ranking above k? It's the complement of that. 1 minus k over n plus 1. That's really simple. It looks complex, but it's really simple. The complement specifies the probability that you will exceed the rank k. If we rearrange that equation and solve for k, we finally get to the probability percentile schedule that John Platt developed in 1973. And that equation is k equals n plus 1 times 1 minus 7. This equation specifies the rank k that you have to exceed in a sample of m observations to obtain criterion responses with an expected probability of W. Where W is an experimentally specified parameter. So, back at the ranch, how did Tiger and I use this to shape longer drives? The first thing we do is the same thing. We generate a small sample of baseline drives. We generate m drives with a habit comparison sample. We then we experimentally select the probability that we want to call the drive criteria. I can make it 20%, I can make it 10%. We then solve for k given the two parameters m and w. So, if I have 3 previous observations and I want to see criteria responses with a probability of 0.25, 3 plus 1 is 4, 1 minus 0.25 is 0.75, k equals 3. So that says you have 3 previous observations, you have to beat all 3 of them, and you will succeed 25% of the time. If you have 19 previous observations and you want to see criterion responses with a probability of 0.25, k equals 20 times 0.75, k equals 15. Of the 19 observations, you have to meet 15. Percentile schedules, the first thing you do is order the drives by the distance, or whatever dimension you shape, not chronologically. So I may go out to the tee and hit a drive 210 yards, flub one 140, hit a fairly decent one 280, and a fourth one 240. Okay? The chronological order is not important in establishing the rank orders. It's the distance, because that's the dimension that we were trying to shape. So we have a rank order 1 from the tee to drive B, rank order 2 is between drive B and drive A, 3 is here, 4 is here, etc. Tiger goes out, hits the same drives, hits them far larger, of course, has a much better distribution, but in fact he has the same ordinal distribution. He's got one rank 1, one rank 2, one rank 3, 4, etc. We implement the percentile schedule by solving for k. So we have 4 observations. We want to have our general probability of 0.4. So we're going to set k equal to 3. So anything that exceeds the third rank is going to be considered criteria. For me, the third rank is somewhere around 245 yards. For Tiger, right now, it's around 310 yards. So, what happens? You just go out and hit a drive, compare it against the rank. My next drive was about 260 yards. That beats K. It's a criteria response, and I win a QP, whatever my reinforcer is. Tiger comes out, he outdrives me, but because his distribution is different, he does not meet the ordinal requirements of the percentile schedule. His drive falls just below the 310 yards that currently defines the third rank. So that is considered a non-criteria response. Now we have a bit of an issue. We have n plus 1 observations. What do we do? You might argue that bigger samples give you better estimates, and so you should just keep accumulating all these responses. The downside of that is the bigger samples also have older responses, which may not be representative behavior, particularly if behaviors change along the differentiation. So the other possibility is to keep only the most recent n plus 1 observations. If you do that, you maintain the sample size and the ability to estimate particular resolution, but you also maintain the observational currency or the representativeness of the sample. And so that's in fact what we do in percentile schedules. We maintain the sequential order of the sample to allow you to do what's called a daisy chain. The daisy chain replaces the oldest observation with the current one, so that you always maintain the most recent M observations in the sample. So, we pull out, we put in the new drives, drive Z in both places, and we pull out the old drives. A disappears. We now have 4 drives left. We have to update the ranks because we now have a different sample. Notice that the change is captured in the change in the absolute value of the kth rank over time. I still have to beat the third response. But the third response now, instead of being here, for me, is up there. For Tiger, on the other hand, instead of being at 310, he's now slightly under 310. That's basically, in a nutshell, how percentile schedules work. The prerequisites for percentile schedules is very simple. The response has to follow along the ordinal dimensions. You have to be able to rank responses relative to other responses. It is helpful, but not absolutely required, that you also not artificially or otherwise limit available response values. The reason you don't want to do this is because with a smaller number of values, the more difficult it is to rank them relative to one another. So you don't want to use binary dimensions. You try to use continuous or extensively discrete dimensions. And you also want to set targets that avoid response ceilings or floors, or if you have to do that, at least have a resolution of measuring devices sufficient to distinguish individual instances at the limits. Some tricks of the trade. You should make m plus 1 a simple divisor of 100. The reason to do that is because it defines integer percentiles within the distribution. If m equals 3, you define quartiles. If m equals 9, you define deciles. If m equals 49, you define 2 percentage points of the distribution. You should make w an even multiple of whatever you define the percentiles to be, such that k is an integer. So if m is 3, you're defining quartiles, then w most easily takes on 0.25, 0.5, or 0.75. And the third trick of the trade is you don't actually have to even rank the responses. All you do is you keep your daisy chain, And when a new response occurs, you loop through the comparison, accumulating counts, comparing the current response with the one in the comparison memory. Each time the current response beats the comparison response, increment a counter. Each time it ties the comparison response, increment a different counter. If the first counter ever gets to be greater than k, it's criterion and you can stop it. If you go through the whole memory and the first counter is still less than k, but the sum of this counter and this counter is greater than k, then it's a criterion response and the probability of 0.7. And if it doesn't beat that counter, if it doesn't beat k, it's not criterion. There's one pitfall in using percentile schedules, and that's sequential dependencies. If the subject comes in and progressively increases or decreases their responding along the dimension, so if I were going to drive 200, 210, 220, 230, 240 yards, I can drive the criterion response probability away from doubling. The tactic to that is to make sure, the tactic to keep that from happening is to ensure that the sample size is longer than the periodicity of the behavior. So if there's a period in behavior, and you capture at least two of those periods, the sequential dependencies in that period will no longer affect the percentile. But the other side of that coin is something we can never forget. And that is that we want the memory to forget. We don't want a memory so long that as your behavior changes, the memory doesn't. So you need to make sure that you balance the length of the comparison sample with the memory. You have to balance those two to provide optimal sensitivity to change and minimize the potential for its use by sequential dependencies. Just to present some data that shows that these actually do work. These are some choice reaction times I collected back in 03 with some rhesus monkeys on a 6-choice procedure. They're basically looking for an X in a matrix of a bunch of crosses. If they pick the correct one, they get 5 seconds of tag. In the baseline, it was a random ratio of 3, probability of 0.33 of reinforcement. Under the percentile, the shortest third of all reaction times produces tag. And you can see very rapidly within the first 10 or so sessions, you have a nice decrease in reaction times. This is just a distribution of reaction times. The baseline here is the front half. So the baseline reaction times are somewhere around 4 seconds for this particular subject. And then within the first 5 days or so, reaction times very quickly move towards shorter and shorter values, peaking just above a half second. Percentiles have also been used with humans as subjects. They've been used as clinical tools. This is a collaboration with Rick Lamb we're doing using percentiles of smoking cessation program. Individuals come in daily with low CO carbon monoxide levels, and if their levels are lower than the percentile requirement that they have, they earn money. And you can see for both these are baseline for these 3 subjects, and implementing the percentile schedule rapidly decreases carbon monoxide levels. The interesting thing about this particular collaboration is that in community intervention programs, substance abuse programs, the long-term success is often related directly to the probability of early reinforcement within the intervention. And percentile schedules guarantee that reinforcement will be delivered. Okay, what we talked about so far are open percentile schedules. They shape values unilaterally, they control global response and reinforcement parameters, but they're limited by the fact that they either shape to a physical limitation in the case of like reaction times, where you just can't go any faster, or there are opposing processes which tend to push them back in the other direction, things like delay of reinforcement or response time. And if you want to develop models, quantitative models of shaping, you don't want to have these opposing processes to deal with. So it might be better to actually shape to a particular target. And so when we're talking about targeted percentile schedules, which push you to a particular specific value of your choice. There's nothing new to learn. The targeted percentile is basically two independent percentiles operating concurrently. One for values below the target, shaping you towards longer and longer values, and one for values above the target, shaping you towards shorter and shorter values. And as you put those two together in operation, they cause the distribution to collapse around the target. This is some more data from shaping run length. These are rats working 24 hours a day. In a two-lever procedure, they go over here and they press the left lever many times they want, and then they press the right lever. That constitutes a run. The number of responses on the left lever is the run length. Under baseline, they have to press the left lever at least once, and they get through with a probability of 0.33. Under the percentile, W was 0.33. So the further the response is closest to the target were considered criteria and reinforced. The target was set under different phases, 6, 12, and 24. And you can see that the attained run lengths track the target very well. It's a very nice physical function. This is the first 5,000 trials for one particular rat, just to show you how these procedures operate in semi-real time. This is a baseline, so the yellow are the reinforced and the pink are the non-reinforced. You can see that there's no relation between responding and run length. When we move to the target of 12, initially the blue, which are the reinforcements, are all on the high side. They're the ones closest to the target. And down here, close to the target, they're not reinforced. As you move up, things that used to get reinforced before, run lengths of 0.6 as they become, as long as they become more and more frequent in the distribution, run lengths of 6 no longer produce reinforcement. As you come up further, runs of 8 and 9, which used to produce reinforcement, no longer do so, etc. And you can see that the distribution of reinforcements and responses collapses nicely over the front. Moving the target back to 6, you get a rapid change in the other direction. We start out reinforcing 8s, 7s, but very quickly those drop down to 6s and 5s, and stays that way for the rest of the condition. I've talked about the probability of criteria response. In fact, when you do shaping, there are two independent decisions you have to make that we don't often think about because we're always trying to do shaping as effectively as we can. But if you want to quantify it, you're actually making two decisions. The first decision is this a criterion response? And that's what the percentile schedule is helping you define. But the second decision is should that response produce reinforcement? None that says we have to reinforce every criteria response. There's nothing that says we can't reinforce non-criteria responses. So that produces a 2x2 outcome matrix, where A, B, C, and D are the self-frequencies of that matrix. And you need at least 3 parameters to describe that matrix. The first is the probability of criterion response. The second two are conditional probabilities of reinforcement given criterion responses and non-criteria responses. And I don't want to go into this in any real detail, except to just show you some data where we looked at contingency effects on run length. This is in that two-lever procedure where W for all conditions here is 0.5. So it's half of the responses closest to the target are considered criteria. And under different conditions, U and V, U is the probability given criteria response, V is the probability of reinforcement given non-criteria response, were manipulated in complement pairs. So U and V were 1, 0, 0.8, 2, 0.7, 3, 0.6, 0.4. We did that because that maintains the overall reinforcement probability Z under all of these conditions equal to 0.5. So no matter what you do in this situation, you always get food half the time. The targets were varied under each condition from 6 to 24, and you can see that as you degrade the contingency, as you do more and more reinforcement for errors, and non-criteria responding, you get less and less control at the lower levels. You still get really good shifting at the short term rates. It's an interesting asymmetry. The point of this is not really to show you these data, but to show you what you don't see. The take-home message is the precise independent variable control that these procedures give. And in independent variables, I'm including W as well. We programmed a probability of W equal to 0.5, and we in fact obtain a probability of W equal to 0.5. We program U and B equal to the complementary pairs, and that's what we obtain. So these provide a wonderful framework to control variables that can influence response differentiation and shaping, free of the behavioral changes that the subjects will undergo during the differentiation. So if anybody is out there looking for the dissertation, I would highly recommend this. And just to be really obnoxious about it, I would point out what standard errors and means are inside those points. And because Steve Hirsch is here today, because I have to introduce him in behavioral economics talk tomorrow, I would just point out that, as I said, the overall probability of reinforcement is completely constant under all of those conditions. The rate of reinforcement, there's some variation based on the rate of the trial initiation. But there's nothing systematic there, which leads us to an interesting treatise on the economics of percentile schedules. Percentile schedules are basically capitalism and socialism balanced. The short-term contingencies of percentile schedules require you to get better and better and better. You are continually undergoing a performance review, and you will occasionally get a merit bonus if you do better. But in fact, they also guarantee the expected rate of criteria responses. And so there's a socialistic safety net underneath, no matter what you do. The advantage to people in the applied field, and I hope there are some here, is that they help you better predict and control just exactly how many reinforcers you're going to need to do your studies, because you control completely reinforcement density. So you can't have some super wizzo subject come in and wipe out your brain. That's it with respect to percentile schedules. I just want to close with a couple of soapbox comments. And the first is that I think our field has through historical accident, blended itself to the breadth of what we can actually do. We tend to think of reinforcement as an increasing rate, and distinction of decreasing rate. But I would point out that it only does that in a situation where rate is the only differentiated dimension. Experimental analysis of behavior has historically primarily differentiated along single dimensions, single discrete dimensions, the presence or absence of a lever race, or the pressing lever in one location or another location in terms of choice. In fact, I much prefer Peter Colleen's notion of reinforcement. Reinforcement works, and I put the word multi-dimensional in here, behavior space, to increase what I would like to call response quality instead of response strength or response rate. Quality is some reciprocal of the difference between what you're doing and what you should be doing, what the optimal response is. And anybody who golfs knows that when you hit the sweet spot on the golf club, your behavior is changed in ways far more drastic than to increase the frequency of good golf swings. Your behavior is changed along multiple dimensions at one time. And it's a mischaracterization of the breadth and the scope of those changes to say that you just increase the frequency or something. I would like to suggest that we need to emphasize the dimensional changes that contingencies create, that they instantiate. And particularly, if somebody wants to get really good, we should start doing multi-dimensional behavioral analysis. And just as a throwaway note, somebody said it yesterday in SQAB, I would also like to emphasize the fact that, to me, steady state is an illusion. Behavior is continuously changing, behavior is continuously being changed. Steady state is where the differentiation is occurring along dimensions that you know. Percentile schedules in real life. I think percentile arrangements much more directly reflect common experience than do the other contingencies that we've studied these past 50 years. If you think about the ways you treat your children, dogs, mothers, spouses, we can continuously adjust the requirements, the expectations of those we shape based on their current behaviors. We begin to take their past performance for granted, and we're telling them how much they love them for doing the same stuff they've always done. We require personal bests of our children before we hand out the reinforcers that they're looking for. And we occasionally even take pity on people and reset criteria if they're incapacitated, slightly hungover, whatever the case may be. Percentile schedules are the way that we internally normalize the contingencies for all of these different people that we need across time and across individuals. So what would Skinner's take on percentile schedules be? I think if we were starting again in 2005 and he had computers available to him, he certainly appreciated the continuous nature of shaping. He appreciated more than most of us the error's multidimensional nature. He certainly was a fan of technologies, created many of his own to develop additional behavioral control. And he appreciated that the operant was a class of behaviors that was clustered in time and differentiated by local reinforcement contingencies and local consequences. And as a result, I think he would have appreciated the kind of control that percentile schedules offer us in the experimental analysis of behavior. And I hope that this talk will give you all an appreciation of it as well. Thank you for your time. Credit for anybody who found the 5 references to standard group. Okay, thank you very much. I think you need to use the microphone so that it's recorded.
You may have already addressed this, but I do have a point clarification on the percentile schedule. When you talk about shaping, for example, golf swings, it's basically the assumption that the person has already got the history of handling a golf. Or do you? I mean, where would you start? Would you use multiple percentile schedules? Is it standing up, right posture, eye coordination?
One of the nice things about percentiles is that you can actually do multi-dimensional shaping without even knowing the dimensions along which you're working. The only key is for you to be able to define that the current response ranks relative to all of the rest of the responses, whatever they may be, currently in comparison. So you can shape across multiple dimensions at once as long as you can keep that ordinal relationship clear in your head. It's, if you want to do a quantification of it, it's much more difficult because you would have to have some multi-dimensional space where you can actually keep quantifying. But in terms of just doing the application, if you have a comparison memory of the past 4 responses, whatever you decide they are, as long as you can tell that this one is closer to the path 3, you can use a percentile to shape it from sitting in a chair, being over there holding the belt.